The morning we boarded the plane to Florence, I remember believing I had done everything right. 10 years of marriage, a successful business, and the kind of love story that people envied from afar. Natalie and I had been through the messy, jagged years of early adulthood, building from nothing in a rented apartment in Queens, all the way to a modest but comfortable home on the Upper West Side. It wasn't about money. It never was, not for me. It was about memory, about meaning. I chose Tuscany for our anniversary because it meant something. It was the place where we'd had our honeymoon. I remembered how her eyes had lit up that first night we drank Chianti on the villa's rooftop, surrounded by the cypress trees and the chirping of invisible cicadas. Back then, I was a different man. No tailored suits, no luxury watch, just a nervous husband with a cheap camera and a heart full of hope. When we arrived, the air was exactly as I remembered it, a mix of dry earth and olive trees. The sun sat low but hot, burning golden through a pale blue sky that looked like it had been painted just for us. I had rented the same villa from 10 years ago, though it had since been remodeled. The shutters were newer. The flowers on the trellis had grown thicker. But it was the same view, the same long stretch of vineyard rolling down into the valley. The same timeless silence broken only by wind and birdsong. I remember watching Natalie as she stepped onto the stone terrace that first afternoon. Her body had changed with time, but she still moved like she carried something delicate inside her, a certain fragility in her posture, a quiet poetry in the way her fingers touched the iron railing. I had planned this for months. I had arranged a private chef for the evening. I had hidden a ring, not a replacement, but a second one inscribed with the words, "Forever starts again." It was meant to be a gesture. Natalie seemed distracted, but I dismissed it. Maybe she was tired from the flight. Maybe her silence was a kind of awe. This place had always done that to us, made us small in the face of beauty. I tried not to overthink it. I unpacked our bags, laid out the clothes, and placed the gift box carefully in the drawer of my nightstand. That night we had wine under the stars. The chef brought out a truffle risotto followed by wild boar stew, and we ate in the garden as candles flickered between us. The days passed gently. Mornings were filled with strong coffee and the slow unfolding of sunlight across the tiles. We visited old monasteries, wandered through sun-drenched alleys of Siena and Cortona. I took photos of her when she wasn't looking, brushing her hair back, examining the frescoes in a cathedral, holding a slice of fig cake with mild surprise. They were beautiful photos. But even then, I knew they were memories I was trying too hard to create. There was a growing distance I didn't want to name. She would spend long minutes in the bathroom with the door locked. She would check her phone, quickly turning the screen away when I glanced over. I blamed myself. I thought maybe I had waited too long to show her she mattered. Maybe I had taken her for granted over the years, another late dinner missed, another business call at bedtime. And now that I was finally giving her what she deserved, maybe it was too late. On the morning of our anniversary, I woke before her. The sky was still lavender, the hills cloaked in soft mist. I slipped outside with a blanket and sat beneath the pergola. I thought about everything. About the early days when she used to leave notes in my briefcase. About the time she stayed up all night baking me a cake when I got my promotion. About the time she miscarried and cried in my arms, asking if she was broken. I had held her then like the world would collapse if I let go. I reached into my pocket and touched the box. The ring inside felt heavier than it should have. Not just gold, but expectation, hope, desperation. I had been preparing a speech, something about redemption and choosing each other all over again. But the words now felt like paper boats on a river too wide to cross. She came out eventually, wrapped in a robe, looking tired. She sat beside me, didn't speak, just leaned her head on my shoulder for a long time. Later, I drove us to a vineyard I had secretly arranged to host a private tasting. The owner greeted us warmly. We had a long table under hanging vines with chilled white wine and a spread of cheeses and olives. It was all perfect, picturesque. Natalie seemed quiet still, but at peace. For a moment, I believed we were okay, that whatever silence stood between us could be broken. That love, like old vines, could grow back even after a long winter. I didn't know it then, but that day would mark the end of the version of my life I had always believed in. That evening, she told me she had something to say. She looked me in the eyes for the first time in days, and there was something behind them, not fear, but finality. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her glass, and for a split second I thought she might be ill. When she said the words, I didn't hear them at first. Or maybe I did, but my mind refused to let them in. Pregnant. It was supposed to be a joy, a gift, a miracle we had tried for so many years, and now, after all this time, it was happening. I remember the exact second her next words landed, not mine. It felt like a canyon opened in my chest. I sat still, paralyzed, while the warmth of the evening died around me. The cicadas fell silent. The wine turned bitter in my mouth. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just watched her face as if waiting for her to say it was a cruel joke, some twisted test of devotion, but there was no apology in her expression, only pain. The ring in my pocket burned like a wound. I walked away without a word, my shoes crunching on the gravel. Somewhere in the distance, dogs barked. A breeze passed through the vineyard, rustling the leaves like the last whisper of a ruined prayer. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. I walked until my legs ached and the twilight dimmed into full darkness, dragging the velvet of night across the hills. I didn't know how far I had gone. The roads in Tuscany all seemed to blur into each other, winding dirt paths, flanked by cypress trees that lean like quiet sentinels of something ancient and unforgiving. There were no lights. Only the moon hung, high and detached, as though it refused to illuminate anything that had just been shattered. It didn't make sense, not immediately. My mind replayed her words over and over again, but it felt surreal, as though they had come from a stranger. For a moment, I even thought I might have misunderstood her. Perhaps I had imagined it. Perhaps the wine and the exhaustion had twisted what she meant. But the hollowness in my chest told me otherwise. Something deep had ruptured, and no matter how many times I tried to rationalize it, the pain surged back, raw, deep, and wordless. I had envisioned this trip as a turning point, a renewal. I had put every ounce of effort, every thread of sentiment into constructing something meaningful. Yet the entire time she had been hiding a truth so massive that it rendered everything else weightless. I wasn't just blindsided. I was stripped, undone. I felt foolish, a man who had wandered lovingly into a burning building, unaware that the flames had already consumed the foundation. The hours passed slowly. Cold crept into my bones. My phone buzzed once. I didn't check it. It was likely her, or maybe not. It didn't matter. I wasn't ready to return. I wasn't ready to hear another word, to see her face, to be within arm's reach of the betrayal that had cracked something vital inside me. And yet, underneath the pain, something else brewed, not rage, not yet, but a dull, growing curiosity. A need to know the rest. The story she hadn't told. When I finally returned to the villa, it was almost dawn. The sky was still dark, but the horizon hinted at the slow return of color. I didn't go inside. I slept outside on a lounge chair by the pool, covered in nothing but my jacket. The morning birds woke me, and with their song came a clarity I hadn't expected. I knew I couldn't stay in limbo. Not here, not with her. The next day was silent. She stayed in the villa and I left early, taking the rental car and driving aimlessly through the countryside. Fields rolled by in endless waves, golden, peaceful, unaware. At one point, I stopped by a roadside cafe and stared into a cappuccino I never drank. I kept seeing her face, not the one she wore when she told me, but the younger version. The woman who used to wait at the door with wet hair and bare feet when I came home late from work. I realized I didn't just grieve the betrayal. I grieved the death of the story I had been telling myself for years. That we were solid, that we were good, that we were unshakable. It's a peculiar sort of heartbreak, not the loss of a person, but the collapse of a belief. And in that collapse, something deeper stirred, shame. Not just at being lied to, but at being so utterly wrong about the person I had loved for a decade. By evening, I returned. The lights inside the villa were on, but it felt dim. The entire place seemed heavier now, like the air itself carried a burden. I passed through without a word, taking only a notebook and walking back out to the terrace. I sat and wrote, not because I wanted to memorialize the pain, but because I needed to see the thoughts outside of my head. The act of writing grounded me. It let me touch the hurt without drowning in it. As I wrote, pieces began to arrange themselves. She hadn't just fallen out of love overnight. People don't cheat without reason, though reasons don't excuse the damage. There had to be signs, and I had missed them, or perhaps ignored them. The long silences, the emotional distance, the trips she took alone, the sudden withdrawal from shared routines. I had assumed she was going through something personal, something temporary. I had even encouraged her to take space to find herself again. Still, what stung most wasn't the physical betrayal. It was the fact that she hadn't told me until now. That she had waited until we were thousands of miles from home, in the heart of what was supposed to be a sacred memory. That she had chosen this moment, this trip, to drop the weight of her confession. I couldn't decide if it was cruelty or cowardice, or perhaps a desperate act of conscience. Maybe she hoped the beauty of this place would soften the truth. That night I lay in bed alone. She had taken the guest room. The air between our rooms was thick, unspoken. I stared at the ceiling for hours. Every creak in the wood felt like a voice whispering things I didn't want to hear. I replayed our entire decade together, the highs, the lows, the mundane in-betweens, trying to spot the fracture points. Where did the gap begin? When did we become two people living parallel lives under the same roof? And then came the inevitable question, who is he? It gnawed at me, not out of jealousy, though that was there too, but out of a need to complete the puzzle. A faceless man now hovered over the memories I held dear. A stranger's shadow had entered the architecture of my marriage, and I needed to know how deep his footprints ran. Did she love him? Was it just a moment of weakness, or was it something more calculated, more deliberate? The not knowing was its own kind of torture. For days, we lived like ghosts in the same house. We barely crossed paths, meals were eaten separately. Words, when spoken, were few and cold. I sensed in her a growing guilt, but also a resignation, as though she had already accepted whatever judgment I would cast. But I wasn't ready for judgment. I wasn't ready for anything. I was still too deep in the wreckage, too lost in the fog of what had been and what now could never be. I didn't speak to anyone back home, not friends, not family. I didn't want their voices in my head. I didn't want sympathy or outrage or advice. I needed space, sacred, painful space, to feel everything fully, to sift through the shards of my reality and decide which, if any, were worth holding on to. I wasn't ready to leave, not yet. Something told me there was more, something left unsaid, something she hadn't told me, and until I knew, I couldn't truly begin to move. One morning, I found myself watching her from the terrace. She stood in the kitchen, unaware of my gaze, pouring coffee with mechanical precision. There was no grace in her movements, no elegance, just a woman hollowed by her own choices. And for the first time since her confession, I felt something besides pain. I felt a strange, detached compassion, not forgiveness, but recognition. She was lost too. She hadn't won anything. Whatever relief she had hoped to gain by telling me, it hadn't arrived. It was then that I made a decision. I needed answers, not to punish, but to understand. I needed the full story, the name, the timeline, the context. Only then could I confront not just her betrayal, but my own blindness. Only then could I decide if I could ever look at her again without seeing someone else's child growing inside her. That evening, I walked to the edge of the vineyard and watched the sun melt into the hills. The sky turned gold, then bruised purple. I closed my eyes and whispered to the silence that I was ready to know. What came next would redefine not only the past 10 years of my life, but everything I thought I understood about love, loyalty, and the quiet fractures that grow into chasms while we're too busy looking away. I've read before that grief doesn't always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it shows up as dust, layering everything quietly until one day you realize you've been breathing it in for weeks. That was what those days became. I wasn't living in Tuscany anymore. I was merely enduring it. The villa that once felt like a sanctuary had turned into a shrine for a marriage already gone. Every wall, every window, every chair held echoes of a love that now only existed as a memory within me. Each morning I rose early before the sun burned through the valley mist. I would wander the narrow dirt paths behind the villa, tracing invisible trails through the vineyard, hoping the rhythm of walking would provide a rhythm to my thoughts. But the thoughts didn't organize. They collided. They spiraled. They ricocheted off each other like broken glass in a locked room. I couldn't eat. Food turned to paste in my mouth. Wine only deepened the ache. I watched birds circle overhead and wondered how long they'd stayed loyal to their skies. I wondered whether pain ever truly fades or if it simply disguises itself with time, wearing new names, new faces. I wondered how Natalie could have done it, how she could carry this secret for weeks, maybe months, lying next to me each night as though nothing had shifted, while inside her, a truth grew that would eventually rip our world apart. I thought about that child, not as a person, but as a symbol, a silent boundary between what we had and what we could never have again. It wasn't the child's fault. I didn't feel hate, not for the unborn and not even fully for her. But there was a slow, corrosive sorrow I couldn't seem to stop. It ate away at everything, at memories, at dreams, at the man I thought I was. I felt hollow. A vessel that had once been filled with direction and purpose, now sloshing aimlessly with confusion and betrayal. For hours I sat at the edge of the pool, watching water move without purpose, stirred only by wind. I stopped checking my phone entirely. I ignored the emails that piled up from clients and staff, ignored even the messages from my assistant reminding me of deadlines. None of it mattered. Business, profit, goals, those were the scaffolding of a life. But what do you build when the foundation underneath you crumbles? What blueprint do you follow when the architect has left mid-design? One afternoon, I found the photo album from our wedding. It was tucked inside the closet next to a stack of old scarves Natalie had packed just in case. I didn't want to look at it, but my fingers acted before my mind could argue. I sat cross-legged on the tiled floor, thumbing through glossy images of joy frozen in time. There we were, smiling, youthful, soaked in light we didn't yet know we would lose. There was a picture of me lifting her off the ground in Central Park, surrounded by friends. And then I saw it, the vow page. She had written her own. I remembered the tears in her eyes as she read them, promises etched in sincerity, delivered with a tremble that had made me believe every syllable. Looking at them now, those words felt like relics from another world. And yet I didn't tear the page. I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I just stared numb, as if waiting for the page to dissolve into something less painful. Eventually, I returned the album to its place, but that moment stayed with me. The realization that betrayal doesn't erase love, it distorts it. It turns the once beautiful into something haunted, like music played backward, like a house still standing but with blood in its walls. I began keeping a journal, not because I needed a record, but because I needed a place to speak without being interrupted by the echoes in my own head. I wrote about the colors of the hills, about the way Natalie's footsteps still made the floor creak the same way they always had. I wrote about the ring still tucked away in my luggage, heavy with meaning it no longer carried. I wrote about Ethan, the name that had finally come up in a brief, clinical exchange between us. No apology, no elaboration. Ethan, I didn't know him. I didn't want to, but his presence now painted itself across the landscape of my pain. He wasn't a man to me. He was an idea, an invasion, an unanswered question. I imagined him tall, smug, careless. I imagined him as every insecurity I had ignored during the years I threw myself into work, thinking that success could substitute for presence. But no matter how much I speculated, I knew the truth was simpler. He existed. One night I awoke in sweat, my heart racing. I had dreamed that the villa was burning and Natalie stood outside it, smiling, holding the child in her arms. I tried to run to her, but my feet were buried in ash. When I woke, the room was cool and silent, but the panic clung to my ribs like chains. I sat up and stared into the dark for a long time, listening to the faint hum of life outside, a dog barking in the distance, a bird shifting in its nest. I began to question everything, not just Natalie's faithfulness, but the architecture of our entire relationship. Had I really been blind, or had I chosen comfort over confrontation? Had I ignored the signs because I believed in our story more than I believed in her? Love, I realized, can become a religion, something we follow even when it hurts, simply because it's easier than facing a life without it. One morning I stood at the edge of the vineyard watching the workers in the distance. Their hands moved with purpose, pruning, harvesting, preparing the land for something new. It struck me then how the land didn't mourn. It accepted. It adapted. It made room for new growth even after seasons of drought and rot. I wondered if I could do the same, if I could replant something in the scorched soil of my heart. That evening I returned to the house determined to confront Natalie, not to yell, not to accuse, but to ask. I needed her truth, her full truth, not the pieces she had offered like scraps tossed to a dog, but the full narrative. I deserved that, at least that. I prepared myself for whatever it would be, shame, denial, remorse, even indifference. I wasn't seeking closure anymore. I was seeking clarity. I was a man drowning, and the only way out was to know how deep the water truly was. I didn't find her in the main room or the kitchen. The villa was quiet, humming only with the sounds of distant insects and the occasional flicker of candlelight on old stone. I knocked gently on the guest room door, but there was no answer. I turned the knob slowly and stepped in. She wasn't there, but on the bed, folded neatly, was a small stack of clothes, a passport, and a letter with my name on it. I didn't touch it, not yet. I stood there, frozen, staring at that envelope as though it contained a bomb. Maybe it did. Maybe it held the final cut, the final unspooling of everything we once were. Or maybe it was an apology. Maybe it was nothing more than a list of facts she didn't have the courage to say out loud. Eventually, I picked it up and walked out to the terrace, sitting beneath the same pergola where we had once toasted our love. I stared at her handwriting, traced it with my thumb, and for the first time since her confession, I wept. Not in silence, not in shame, but openly, fully. I cried for who we were, for what we lost, for the man I used to be. And then I opened the letter. I opened the letter with trembling hands, expecting devastation, expecting blood. But the paper inside was not soaked in venom or apology. It was cool, clinical, handwritten, yes, but cold in tone. It lacked the cracks and tremors I thought guilt would bring. The words were arranged in straight lines, measured like fence posts dividing two properties, hers and mine, no longer shared. She explained that she needed space, not out of anger, not even fear, but exhaustion. She wrote that she was leaving Tuscany early to clear her head. She said I didn't deserve to be asked for answers, not now, not in this moment of pain, but she hoped someday I'd seek the whole truth, not just about her mistake, but about what had led us to this place. She did not blame me outright, but her words curved gently in that direction. She called it a slow unraveling, the way we became partners in name but not in spirit. And there, buried in the third paragraph, was his name again, Ethan. A name that had lived only in the shadows of my imagination, now placed with deliberate finality into the story of my life. She said it wasn't a love affair. It wasn't a decision made in candlelight. It happened once in the dull hum of an office party. She described herself as being too drunk, too angry, too empty. It wasn't passionate, she said. It was messy, mechanical, shameful. It was not about Ethan, it was about me, about us. About a silence between us that had become unbearable. She had not planned to get pregnant. She had cried for days when she found out. She ended the letter by saying she would not ask for forgiveness. She would carry the consequences. She was not running away, she claimed, only stepping aside to allow me room to breathe, to rage, to think. I sat with the letter for a long time. I didn't tear it. I didn't burn it. I folded it carefully and placed it inside the pocket of my coat, like a scar sewn into the lining of my memory. But something had shifted. Until then, Ethan had been just a shape, a shadow, a void I projected anger into. Now, with his name in ink and his presence confirmed, I felt a new urgency rise, not jealousy, not vengeance, but an aching need to understand. Not just who he was, but what he meant, what he represented. How a man like that could become part of my story without my knowledge or consent. I began to dig. Back in the villa, I powered up my laptop and searched everything I could about Ethan Carr. It didn't take long. He had been employed by the same firm where Natalie once worked in PR. His profile showed an average face, forgettable almost, sandy brown hair, average build, the kind of face you wouldn't notice twice in a room full of executives. But then I found the whispers. An anonymous blog from a former employee mentioned his name. The post spoke of inappropriate remarks, suggestive behavior at holiday parties, subtle coercion in mentorship programs, nothing confirmed, no lawsuits, no public accusations, just stories, vague and unfinished, floating in the digital ether like warning buoys in a storm. I found his social media, locked down but still traceable. I stared at the images, him at a bar, him at a conference, him with a different woman in each post. There was no sign of guilt, no sign of Natalie, no mention of Tuscany or a child or anything that might tether his orbit to mine, and that somehow was worse. To know that for him this was likely nothing, a footnote, a night, a mistake forgotten before morning, while for me it was the unraveling of a decade, the implosion of identity. And yet I couldn't look away. I stared at his eyes in each photo, trying to find the fracture, the flaw. I wanted to see the cruelty, the manipulation, but all I saw was vacancy. A man unaware of the damage he'd done, or perhaps unwilling to care. Still, something didn't sit right. If Natalie described it as mechanical, regrettable, why had she protected him for so long? Why had she delayed telling me? Why had she carried the secret across oceans and anniversaries, waiting until this trip to release it? Was there more? Was she telling the truth, the whole truth? Or just the parts she thought I could handle? I began to spiral, not in rage, but in obsession. I needed to confront the shape of the story. I needed to stand in the storm, even if it tore me to pieces. So I hired someone, a contact back in New York, a man I had once used to investigate a fraud case for my company. Discreet, thorough. I gave him Ethan's name, Natalie's office address, and a brief summary. I told him to dig, to trace timelines, to find emails, to listen to whispers in the spaces between meetings. The days passed slowly while I waited. Natalie remained gone, and the villa became something like a monastery. I woke early, meditated in silence, walked miles each day through the hills. I no longer cried. The tears had dried into something sharper. I began writing again, not in a journal, but in essays, meditations on heartbreak, on betrayal, on the quiet rituals of grief that men are never taught how to perform. I discovered a strange clarity in solitude. I realized how little time I had spent with myself over the years, always busy, always distracted, always filling the void with movement. Now in stillness I heard my own thoughts like a song I hadn't noticed playing all along. I was not innocent. I had not cheated, but I had failed in other ways. I had grown comfortable in silence. I had mistaken routine for romance. One morning the email arrived. A short report, a timeline, an attachment. I opened it without ceremony. It began with a calendar of Natalie's meetings over the past year, matched against Ethan's multiple overlaps, late-night strategy sessions, one conference in Miami where both had stayed 3 nights longer than necessary. And then the messages. Screenshots of texts obtained from a cloud backup Ethan had forgotten to secure. Some flirtatious, some ambiguous, one explicit, dated just a week before she told me about the pregnancy. I sat back, the room tilted slightly. The air thickened, she had lied. It wasn't one time. It wasn't a drunken mistake. It had been a pattern, maybe not a full-blown affair with weekends away and second phones. But it was more than what she said, more than what she was willing to give me in that letter. She had protected the story more than she had protected the marriage. I didn't feel anger, not right away. I felt tired, a bone-deep weariness that felt older than me. I thought of all the times I had made excuses for her distance, had blamed myself, had tried to rekindle a flame that she had already carried elsewhere. But then came the wave, the rising of heat in my throat, the dizzy, breathless fury that made my vision blur. I was not just betrayed, I was manipulated. She had chosen to tell me part of the truth in a setting designed to distract me with nostalgia. Tuscany, our beginning. She had offered a curated version of her sin, hoping the location would soften the edges. And I had nearly fallen for it. That night I walked back to the vineyard, tracing the path through the olive trees as the moon rose. I thought about the man I had become in the shadow of this truth, not broken but forged. There was pain, yes, but pain had refined me, stripped away illusion, left me raw but honest. I reached the edge of the hill and looked out across the valley. Somewhere down there in another village, people were laughing, drinking wine, holding hands without fear. And I felt something strange, not envy, not bitterness, but a fragile kind of hope. That maybe one day I would return here, not to forget her, not to erase what we had, but to thank the land for giving me back to myself. The past would always echo. Her face, her voice, her touch. The memories wouldn't die, but they would lose power, and in their place I would grow something new, something rooted in truth. The next morning I booked my flight home. The day I left Tuscany, the skies were clear, brutally, beautifully so. There wasn't a cloud to hide behind, no drizzle to mask the weight in my chest. The sun lit everything with a clarity that felt cruel. The same vineyards I had walked through in silence now looked indifferent to my pain, like witnesses that refused to testify. It was a strange sensation to pack a suitcase not just with clothes, but with a decade's worth of disillusionment. On the flight home, I stared blankly out the window. The soft curve of the earth below reminded me how small I was, how laughably insignificant our tragedies must seem from high above. Yet inside me the grief took up space, settled into my ribcage, and refused to move. I did not cry. I didn't fume. I existed in a state beyond reaction, as if the emotional system had burned itself out and left only the skeleton of thought behind. When I landed in New York, the city greeted me with its usual noise and chaos, but even that felt distant, like I was behind glass. I returned to the apartment, ours, though it no longer felt shared. Natalie wasn't there. She hadn't returned yet. The silence was no longer a relief. It was an echo. Her absence was not healing. It was a vacuum. I walked through each room like a curator in a museum of a life no longer mine. The bookshelves still bore her taste, French memoirs, poetry collections with underlined verses. The kitchen still smelled faintly of rosemary, a spice she had once insisted I learn to appreciate. I touched the piano keys she used to play on Sunday mornings, and they gave no sound. I didn't press them. I couldn't bear to hear their voice without her fingers. I knew what I had to do, but I also knew I would delay doing it, not because I had hope. Hope had already exited the stage, but because letting go is never a clean act. It is messy, circular, full of phantom touches and muscle memory. You can know something is over and still reach for it in the dark. You can sign papers, move boxes, change locks, and still, part of you waits for footsteps that will never return. That night I called my lawyer, not to begin divorce proceedings, not yet, but to ask questions, to prepare the ground. I needed to know what it would look like, what it would cost, how to navigate it without the bitterness that poisons everything it touches. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to destroy her. I just wanted to reclaim myself. I spent the following days sorting through documents, canceling joint plans, rerouting subscriptions and addresses. Each administrative step felt like a needle, small, precise, but necessary. I moved into the guest room. I removed our wedding photo from the hallway wall, not out of spite, but because I could no longer walk past it without feeling my lungs shrink. And then, without warning, she returned. She didn't announce herself. She simply walked through the door one afternoon, carrying nothing but a purse and a folded coat. I saw her from the kitchen, and for a moment my heart lurched, not in affection, but in the stunned recognition of someone who used to be home. Her eyes were tired. Her movements were careful. She didn't speak. She looked at me and then looked away. She spent that first night in silence, retreating to the master bedroom while I remained in the guest room, separated by a hallway that felt like a continent. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what more there was to say, but my mind had already begun to move differently. I was no longer driven by emotion. I was driven by clarity, and clarity is cold. It doesn't scream. It doesn't plead. It simply stands there, undeniable. The next morning, she left a sealed envelope on the dining table. This one was not a letter. It was a folder, medical reports, ultrasound images, and a typed statement from her OB-GYN. There was no note attached, just facts. I read through them with the same numbness I had carried through Tuscany. The child was healthy. The timeline confirmed everything I had already learned. There were no lies left to uncover. There was only aftermath. Strangely, that helped. It removed ambiguity. It closed the last door I had been tempted to keep cracked open. There would be no miracle, no late-night confession that rewrote the story. What had happened, and I was not going to be a part of that child's life, not by blood, not by bond, and not by choice. I spent that day walking the city. I didn't bring a destination. I passed parks, restaurants, office buildings, all haunted by ghosts of our past selves. The city was full of versions of us, eating at that sushi place on Lexington, holding hands near the fountain at Bryant Park, laughing in the back of yellow cabs. They all walked past me like strangers now, and I let them go, one by one. Eventually, I returned home and began drafting the email. I wrote to my lawyer. I gave instructions. It was time. But before anything formal could be filed, something happened that I did not expect. My assistant, Mia, called me into the office for an urgent matter. I hadn't been back to the office since before the trip. The company had been running on autopilot under trusted managers. When I arrived, everyone's faces turned subtly toward me, not out of curiosity, but concern. Something was wrong. In my office, Mia handed me an envelope that had been delivered without return address. Inside were printed screenshots, some of which I recognized. They were from the investigator I had hired, but others were new, a deeper dive. One particular image struck me. It was of Ethan, not with Natalie, but with another woman. And then another. And then one more, all from within the same company, dated across a span of months. The implications were immediate. Ethan wasn't just reckless, he was predatory. And Natalie had been part of a pattern, possibly even manipulated, pressured into silence as others had been. Some of the texts now read differently. The tone in them wasn't always complicit. Some felt coerced. Some felt fearful. A pattern of power imbalance emerged. It wasn't just infidelity. It was a culture, a system. I didn't know what to do with that knowledge. I wasn't ready to forgive her. I wasn't even ready to feel sorry for her, but it recontextualized everything. I had built my rage around the belief that she had acted alone, freely. Now I saw chains where I had assumed freedom. Back home, I confronted her, not with words, but with the envelope. She didn't flinch. She looked at the pages and then sat down quietly, her face ashen. I stood across from her, arms folded, heart pounding. In that moment, I saw not a villain, but a woman who had collapsed quietly under years of pressure. Someone who had made a mistake, yes, but perhaps from a place of pain I had never been allowed to witness. I did not absolve her, but I saw her. For the first time in weeks, I saw her without rage, without pity, just as a flawed, wounded human being. And that is when I made my decision. I would not stay, but I would not destroy her either. I gave her space to seek legal counsel. I offered to mediate fairly. I ensured she would have what she needed to move forward with the pregnancy. I told her I would be stepping away, not just from the marriage, but from the emotional wreckage we had both created. There would be no grand gesture, no public battle, just a quiet severing of ties between two people who had loved once and lost slowly. In the weeks that followed, I moved into a small loft downtown, sparse, clean, unfamiliar. The silence was sharp, but it was honest. I began to rebuild, not with revenge, not with rebound relationships, but with therapy, with time, with long walks through unfamiliar neighborhoods. I rediscovered my appetite, my curiosity, my willingness to laugh. One evening, I found a letter in my mailbox, from Natalie. She wrote that she understood now, that she was sorry for the way she'd handled it, not just the affair, but everything, the silence, the half-truths, the fear. She didn't ask for reconciliation, only for peace. And I granted it. We signed the papers a month later in a courthouse that smelled like bureaucracy and dust. No tears, no accusations, just 2 pens, 2 signatures, and 2 separate futures. I walked out of the building and took a long breath. The air felt different. Later, after the final papers were signed and filed, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel relief. I felt still. It was the kind of stillness that arrives not after victory, but after weathering a storm so long, so violently, that when the silence finally comes, your ears keep ringing. I had walked out of the courthouse alone, hands in pockets, the echo of footsteps and bureaucratic voices fading behind me. There had been no witnesses, no family, no tearful scenes. In the weeks that followed, life unfolded slowly. It didn't rush to fill the gaps Natalie had left. It didn't offer grand epiphanies or dramatic renewals. It simply moved. Mornings came and I got out of bed. I made coffee. I read the news. I responded to emails. I went to work. I returned home. Routine, stripped of sentiment, but steady. There's a strange comfort in the mundane, especially when your soul is tender and recovering. I didn't need fireworks. I needed peace. The loft I had moved into was sparse, almost monastic. Bare walls, a few pieces of furniture, a small record player in the corner. I filled the space gradually, not just with things, but with intention. Every book placed on the shelf was one I had chosen for myself. Every framed photo came with no ghosts attached. I began cooking again, something I hadn't done in years. Natalie and I didn't speak much after the divorce. There were a few formal correspondences through lawyers, some logistical updates, a letter informing me of the baby's due date, but nothing more. I didn't ask for photos. I didn't ask if it was a boy or girl. That chapter, as painful and tangled as it was, had closed, and I wasn't interested in revisiting its pages unless absolutely necessary. But I did think about her sometimes, not with anger, not even with longing, just curiosity, wondering how she was navigating the choices she had made, whether she had found clarity in the ruins the way I eventually had. I didn't wish her harm. I didn't wish her happiness either, not because I didn't want it for her, but because it was no longer my place to wish anything at all. That power had been returned, whether I wanted it or not. In therapy, I spoke often about betrayal, but more than that, I spoke about identity. How easy it is to lose yourself in the idea of a marriage. How you become not just someone's partner, but someone else's witness, someone else's reflection. When that person fades or fractures, your own image can shatter too. And then you're left gathering pieces, unsure which ones are truly yours. I remembered the man I had been at the beginning, wide-eyed, eager, quietly romantic. The man who believed in lasting love because he wanted it to be true. Over the years, I had traded pieces of that man for ambition, for structure, for the illusion of stability. Now, standing in the middle of an unfamiliar apartment with no ring on my finger and no one waiting for me, I had to decide who I wanted to become next. So I traveled, not to escape, but to see the world with different eyes. I visited old bookstores in Prague. I watched fishermen haul nets on the Amalfi coast. I sat in silence under the red cliffs of Sedona and listened to the earth hum beneath my feet. I didn't chase joy. I didn't post photos. I simply was, present, breathing, observing. There's something liberating in being a stranger among strangers, in no longer being tethered to someone else's expectations. In the quiet, I began to remember how to listen to myself again. One morning in a small cafe in Lisbon, I watched an elderly couple share breakfast. They didn't speak much. He read a paper and she gently tapped his wrist every time the coffee ran low. It wasn't cinematic, it wasn't poetic, but it was real. I realized then that I still believed in love, not the fever dream kind, not the one that shouts and burns and demands, but the one that hums quietly in the background, steady and consistent. I wasn't ready for it yet. Back home, I found rhythm again. I took long walks in the early evening. I learned to enjoy my own company. I reconnected with old friends who had drifted away during the marital years. I didn't tell them everything. Some things are too personal to narrate over wine and appetizers, but they saw the change. They saw the man who had cracked open, endured, and emerged not unscathed, but aware. One afternoon, I returned to the rooftop garden of my office building, a place I used to visit when I needed to think. The skyline stretched in every direction, unapologetic in its sprawl. I sat there as the wind moved around me, and I let myself feel the fullness of the journey I had taken. From the warmth of vows whispered in a chapel, to the cold silence of an empty villa, to the slow rebuilding of something like faith. I remembered the ring I never gave her. It had remained in my drawer all this time untouched. I didn't know why I had kept it. Maybe part of me had needed to hold onto a symbol of what could have been. That night, I took it from the drawer and walked to the river. The Hudson glittered under the city lights, indifferent and eternal. I held the ring for a while, turning it in my fingers, watching the inscription catch the light. Forever starts again. I let it go, not as an act of bitterness, but as a benediction. The splash was small, barely noticeable, but inside something shifted. A release. A goodbye that no courtroom could have offered. I walked home with my hands in my pockets, empty but no longer lost. Time continued its quiet work. Seasons changed. The city moved forward as cities always do. One morning I received a letter from Natalie. It was brief. She had given birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Caleb. She said she didn't expect anything from me, only that I should know. She hoped life had been kind to me. I read the letter twice. Then I placed it in a box, not to hide it, but to respect it. Caleb was not my son, but he would grow in a world shaped by choices I had once been part of. I wished him strength. That was all I could do. Years passed, and somewhere along the way, love returned. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It arrived as a friendship, A quiet companionship with someone who saw the world through similar eyes, tender, bruised, but open. We didn't rush. We didn't promise forever. We simply showed up for each other. Day by day, kindness by kindness. I never told her the whole story, not at first. But when I did, she listened, not with judgment, but with understanding. She too had her own griefs, her own ghosts. We didn't try to fix each other. We simply sat with the brokenness until it softened. One evening, we stood by a window overlooking the rain. She reached for my hand, and I let her hold it. Not because I needed saving, but because I had saved myself, and now I had room for someone new. There are no perfect endings, only honest ones. And in honesty, I had found peace.